in the garage today. I'm going to work on a 2003 Arctic Cat 500. I noticed while I was bleeding the brake lines last week that I've got a broken right drive axle, and so I'm going to replace that today, and I'm going to show you how that's done. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is lift up the back end. Using a 17 millimeter. And here you can see that broken crown nut. It's snapped off right there. Here's a close-up of that right hub, and we're going to need to remove the handbrake as well as the foot brake from this side. And so if we just look behind the hub, there's going to be two 10 millimeter bolts on the rear side holding on the handbrake, as well as two more holding on that foot brake. So give those a little spray of lube, let it sit for a little while. And then I'll probably use a combination of a box wrench, 10 millimeter, as well as a socket to remove those. Okay, so using some voiceover because my garage heater is so loud, I'm starting out with the box wrench just to loosen up these bolts. And once I get them loose enough, then I'll just switch over to a 10 millimeter socket, and just to get those things off the rest of the way. These are kind of in an awkward position, so I just use my hand to kind of unscrew them as best I can. Once you get these out, you're going to want to really carefully pull off this caliper. And what I use is an old hanger that I've kind of bent around using for brake jobs. And I just kind of loop it around the A-arm and around the brake, and just get it hung up so there's not a lot of tension on that brake line. You don't want to damage that line while you're working on your axle. Okay, so with the handbrake out of the way, now I'm working on the auxiliary brake. And again, just loosening those bolts first with a crescent, then a socket, and then finally I'll unscrew them the rest of the way with my fingers. Once I pull those out, then I will be able to slide that brake assembly off the disc. And again, using a hanger, I'm going to wrap a wire around it and then just hang it up on the shock, which is kind of sitting right there. And again, getting it out of the way, because once we start working on the axle, we don't want to damage these brake lines. All right, so we're working on the axle housing next. I'm going to put a little penetrating oil on both ends of the bolts. And then what I'll do is I'm going to use an impact on that 17 millimeter bolt to loosen that up. All right, so once I've broken those free with the impact, then I'm just going to use a 17 millimeter deep socket as well as a 13 millimeter socket, and then just work both ends and get those loose. Now the top of the axle housing I'm not actually going to remove, so I'm just going to loosen those bolts. But on the bottom, I am going to back those out all the way, because that's how I want to open up the axle housing. So when I pull off that bottom bolt, I did see a lot of oxidation on it, so I just made a mental note that I'm going to put a little grease on that before I reinstall it. Alright, so now because my crown nut was snapped off, I can actually remove the brake disc from the axle, and I'm just going to set that aside on a piece of wood. I don't want to get that scratched or anything. But now I'll be able to open up that axle housing or knuckle or whatever you want to call it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a bungee cord, wrap it around the top of the frame, cargo frame, and then just hook it on to that axle housing, just to have it out of the way. And then I can, that gives me better access to that axle. So the best way to get this axle out is to get yourself in a good strong position and just give it a nice firm tug, and you'll kind of break free the brake ring that's kind of holding the splines inside that differential housing. You can take a look at it there. And I'm just going to take the camera and show you what the inside of that housing looks like. And now you're just going to position yourself to install the new one. I ended up finding a new drive axle on the internet. This one is from Sixity. It was about $70. I haven't bought anything from them before. So first thing I want to do is just kind of open up this new drive axle and lay it down next to the old one. And obviously it's going to be a little shorter with that snapped shaft where the crown nut goes. But I just want to get a good look at the components to make sure that it indeed is a good fit. And for what I'm seeing, this looks pretty good. So we will go ahead with the installation. I'm going to apply a little 80 weight differential fluid to the splines on that new drive axle, just to lube them up a little bit before I go ahead and try and slide this thing in. And in this case, I do have a rubber mallet that's going to help me get this thing in. So first thing I'm going to do is just kind of fish it in there and get the splines lined up so that they go in smoothly. Once I get it kind of started, it really won't go in by itself. So I end up getting a rubber mallet and just kind of holding it as straight as possible, and then just kind of hammering on the end of that crown nut. I am leaving the crown nut on just to kind of protect the threads. Again, I am using a rubber mallet, but here you can see it snap into position. And once it's in, then we're ready for the next step. So I'm just going to spin off that crown nut, and then we'll start lowering the axle housing and kind of threading the end of that axle through it. Once we've lowered that axle housing back into place, we're going to take that bottom bolt, and as I said before, I did notice a little oxidation on it, so I'm just going to put a little lube on it. Then I'm going to slide it back in, and we can start to put the suspension back together. Next, I'm going to grab that brake disc and hub assembly, and I'm just going to apply a little of that 80 weight differential oil to the splines, and really that's just to help it slide onto the end of that axle. Next, I'm going to grab the crown nut, and I will get that threaded, and I'll just spin it on by hand. This is going to require a 30mm socket, and I'm going to torque it to 75 foot-pounds, which is according to the torque specifications. Obviously, I have to lower that wheel so the other side doesn't spin, and then I can set the torque. Now I'm going to tighten the two bolts that hold the axle housing to those A arms. These are going to get tightened to 40 foot-pounds. In order to tighten the axle housing bolts, I'm using two wrenches. One has a 13 millimeter and that goes on the head of the bolt, and the nut is a 17 millimeter nut. And I'm just cranking those down until they're nice and snug, and then I will pull out my torque wrench and set them to 40 foot-pounds each. There's 40. All right, now I'm going to carefully put the hydraulic caliper assembly. Until you get the caliper on, those brake pads kind of bounce around inside there, so I'm using a little screwdriver to keep them separated, and that helps me just slide it right onto that disc. Now you are ready to insert your 10 millimeter bolts to hold that caliper back on. And I'll speed things up a little bit here so we can get to the next step. With the caliper bolts snug, now I'm just going to set the torque to 20 foot-pounds. Again, this is on the hydraulic caliper. Moving over to the auxiliary brake, first I'm going to do is remove that hanger. Now the brake pads actually fell out of the housing on this side, so I'm going to slide those back in. And again, they kind of bounce around until you get it on the brake disc. So once I slide these brake pads back in, I am going to use that screwdriver again, and I just kind of put that screwdriver in there to hold the brake pads apart with a gap. And that allows me to slide it onto the disc, and then I can grab my bolts and repeat the process. I'm just going to thread them in by hand and tighten them to about 15 foot-pounds. In this case, the torque wrench actually, there's nowhere to fit it in unless I remove the shock, which I'm not going to do during this project. So I'm just going to tighten them hand tight to what I feel is about 15 foot-pounds. So gentle pressure. So with the brakes reinstalled, I will just go ahead and check the foot brake as well as the hand brake. We've got the new drive axle installed nice and snug. We've tightened up all of our A-frame bolts. We've got our hydraulic and our auxiliary brake back on. We've tightened the crown nut to 75 pounds per square inch. And now we just need to put the wheel back on. I did lose a little fluid putting the drive axle back in, so I am going to put a 17 millimeter on that nut right there, and I'll open up that differential and add a little more 80 weight fluid. Easiest way to get at that is just a couple of extensions and unscrew that. It's made of plastic, so just be careful with it. And to add my fluid, I'm just using, you can use a straw if you've got an extra tube laying around, and I just top it off so that it's at the bottom of that hole. I've got a nice light hanging, but you can also just kind of stick your finger into the hole and make sure that you feel that lubricant just below the edge of that threaded hole. when you do reinstall the plug, again, my recommendation is just to go snug, but don't over tighten it. You don't want to strip that out or break it. And again, it is plastic. And of course, don't forget to install that cotter pin through the end of your crown nut, and then just use a needle nose to spread the ends of that so it stays in. At this point, you are ready to put your wheel back on, and I like to put a little anti-seize on the ends of those bolts, and then I will thread on my lug nuts, and those are going to be tightened to 40 foot-pounds. And at this point, the new drive axle is installed. We can lower our jack, and this project is a wrap.